Okay, so this session is about the occupation of the Cammell Laird shipyard in Birkenhead, which is on the Wirral Merseyside, that took place in 1984. Eddie Marnell, one of the occupiers, is due to speak today, but he's not very well. He's got a hospital appointment, so he isn't able to come. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to do an introduction to occupations and sit-down strikes. John is then going to talk about what he covered in the pamphlet and what happened around the occupation. Then it's going to come back to me, and I'm going to pretend to be Eddie Marnell and tell some stories of the occupation, and then going to sort of draw out some of the lessons of maybe occupations and sit-ins in general, and then it'll be open for contributions and discussion. So I hope that's all right with everybody, and I'll try and do my best accent when I'm Eddie a little bit later on. Okay, so first of all, so some of the background to workplace occupations and sit-down strikes. The sort of occupations and sit-down strikes have been part of the arsenal of the labour movement since the time of the Industrial Revolution. However, they made a greater impact in the 20th century as factory concentration grew and individual production units developed inside, so the workplaces became more concentrated and bigger in size. The most dramatic occupations were those during the Russian Revolution in 1917. Others that comrades may have heard of and will probably have quite a lot of knowledge of are the wave of factory occupations in Italy, which took place in 1919 to 1920, when almost 100,000 workers occupied their factories after being locked out. There, the factory councils took over, production continued, which laid the basis for later demanding pay for the days of the occupation, which was a demand that they'd largely won. And in that instance, in the 1919 to 1920, it also demonstrated that workers could run the factories without the bosses. Another sort of series of occupations, again, that comrades here might have quite a lot of knowledge of, is the occupations of the car plants in America in the 1930s, which ultimately led to union recognition in the Ford Combine. In 1936, there were 48 sit-down strikes involving 87,817 workers. In 1937, there were 477 occupations involving 398,000 workers. And in 1938, there were 52 involving 28,749 workers. And again, like comrades will have read some of the writings of Janora Dollinger and others about those occupations and the stories and the lessons that were learned during them. Before the occupations in America, the factory occupations had been effectively used in Poland, and Polish immigrants brought them with them to the USA, which is why many of the auto workers called it the Polish tactic. The US car workers also saw occupations as being an advanced tactic as opposed to the strike, which meant that it was easier to stop scabs, and in America in particular, it seemed that it was less dangerous than going on strike and being on the picket line. You were much less likely to die. There are many other examples across the world of the use of sit-ins of workplace occupations. France in May '68, Solidarność in Poland in the 1980s, and I'm guessing the comrades will all have your favourites and ones that you sort of know most about. In Britain too, there's a history of class struggle the history of class struggle has been punctuated by sit-ins and occupations. Groups of British miners and railway workers staged stay-downs or stay-in strikes in the 1920s and 30s. In post-war Britain before 1970, there were a number of short stay-in strikes from the car industry, and a significant one that lasted a lot longer and involved more workers was in 1958 in Belfast, where 6,000 workers staged a 24-hour stay-in strike. So in times of heightened class struggle, the occupations become fairly common. In 1971, workers at the Upper Clyde shipbuilders in Glasgow staged a work-in. And in 1972, there was a wave of occupations of engineering factories in the Manchester area, And the Fisher Bendix plant in Kirby was occupied for 5 weeks. Between 1970 and 1981, there were 264 factory occupations, and only 69 of them were defensive ones, so against a closure, where it was the last attempt to sort of stop something happening. The rest were around winning demands. As the economic situation deteriorated, occupations tended to become more defensive, and after 1979, they became much rarer. Between 1979 and 1985, there were an estimated 100 occupations, and after that, the number declined. So that's just a little bit of background to occupations and sit-ins around this time and before this time. So now I'll hand over to John to talk about the specifics of what happened at Cammell Laird.
Okay, sometime last year, I don't remember when, I got a phone call from Martin. And he said, why don't you write a pamphlet about the occupation of Cammell Laird shipyard? Just like that. I foolishly agreed. The result is this pamphlet, which I hope you've all got, and I'll say a little bit more about it later. The reason for producing the pamphlet, basically, first of all, to celebrate an important struggle, which at the time, and I think this is something that will probably recur as we discuss the strike and the occupation of Cammell Laird. It occurred at the same time as the miners' strike, and it's probably not making any critical point of anybody, but it probably the occupation probably was overshadowed, certainly nationally, by the miners' strike. And that's only understandable. But nevertheless, it was an important strike, and one of our comrades at the time, Lol Duffy, who was a member of Socialist Organiser, was the secretary of the Occupation Committee. I'll say a bit about Lol in a little bit. So it's something that was not only nationally important, certainly very important on Merseyside and Wirral, but it was also something that, from our point of view, it involved one of our comrades in a leading position in the Occupation Committee. Secondly, we wanted to provide a record of what happened. Material had been written about this strike, and I dug up quite a bit of it in my research for the pamphlet, but most of it was in sort of like academic journals, sort of the Journal for Labour Studies or the Journal for Labour Relations and all this sort of stuff, and not the kind of thing that you can readily get your hands on. And also written in that turgid academic style that sort of guaranteed to just put you asleep. And I've been an academic myself for a few years, and it's one of the things that always riled me. Not the kind of thing that's going to be, on the shelves in your local bookshop. So I wanted to provide a record of what happened, and then thirdly, to try and tease out a few lessons from this struggle that could point to the future. Fourthly, to assist in what is now an ongoing campaign to obtain pardons for the 37 occupiers who were arrested and imprisoned, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. You will see figures of 43 being bandied around. There were 43 occupiers arrested, and 37 of which were sent to Walton Jail for 3 months of their sort of sentence length. I don't know why the 6 who weren't in prison. Maybe they just had nice faces or something. The judge fell asleep. I don't know. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason here. Nobody's certainly been able to offer me an explanation. Not that I'm saying they should have been in prison. And I think finally, and very important, it's very inspirational. It's very inspirational to read about workers who took on what was at that time, although it was a seriously declining industry, Cammell Laird was still a powerful employer and had the backing of the Shipbuilders Federation, and of course had the usual backing from the media, Conservative government, and so on. And also, I might say a little bit about this later, and I don't want to dwell on it too much because it sticks in my throat. The local Labour MP, and I'm sure most of you will, his name will ring a bell, Frank Field, didn't support the occupation, surprise, and this self-proclaimed friend of Margaret Thatcher, an advisor to Margaret Thatcher, who was also claimed as Michael Heseltine as his personal buddy, denounced the strike. He said, apparently he said in a conversation with Heseltine, these people are just a bunch of troublemakers. They're just rabble-rousers. That's Frank Field. Elaine has already said a little bit about occupations, and obviously the idea of occupation is central to a pamphlet which is about an occupation. There's a brief historical overview in the pamphlet of some of the occupations that Elaine has mentioned. And at the back of the pamphlet is a reading list. And if you want to bone up on that magnificent story about the automobile plant occupations in North America, and on the Turin strike, the Italian occupations, there's some reading material listed at the back of the pamphlet as an index. So again, these are very inspirational. I particularly love the narrative of the American occupiers. It's just a fantastic story. And out of the automobile workers' occupations and strikes, the automobile workers' union was born. So it's very important from a whole number of points of view. This is not the place to give you a rundown of the British shipbuilding industry. This is a fairly depressing topic in many ways. I've got quite a bit of background in the pamphlet about the decline of the British shipbuilding industry. Once dominated the world. Before the First World War, just about every ship that was built in either Northern Ireland, Scotland, or at shipyards in England. I use the example of the famous battle in the Tsushima Straits off the coast of Japan between the Japanese Imperial Fleet and the Russian Imperial Fleet. The Japanese just blew them out of the water. The demoralization and the defeat that set in after Tsushima Straits was one of the factors leading up to the 1905 revolution. What often gets missed is virtually the entire Japanese fleet was built at Barrow, or some of them at Cammell Laird, and some of them in Northern Ireland. All the battleships, 6 battleships, built in Britain. All the armoured cruisers built in Britain. And they were fast, they were mobile, they were very powerful, and they just destroyed the Russian Imperial Fleet. And again, as I said, a spark, an important spark that led to the 1905 revolution from the demoralization that set in. So it's interesting to make these peculiar connections. You wouldn't think that we could go from British shipyard to the Russian Revolution via Japan, but it's always interesting to make these connections. So the Cammell Laird yard in Birkenhead was faced with problems faced by the entire British shipbuilding industry. Certainly from the end of the Second World War, if not before, it began to fall seriously behind in competition with particularly Japan, but also Western Germany and Korea. That's South Korea, not North Korea. It's an old story. The revived capitalism of Western Germany and the revived capitalist industry of Japan was far too modern, dynamic, introduced new techniques, and it soon overtook the British industry. And the British shipbuilding industry went into serious decline. And from about the mid-50s onwards, the industrial news was regularly punctuated with news of either shipyard closures or redundancies. And by the time of 1984, Cammell Laird was by no means immune to this process. The workforce at Cammell Laird had been drastically reduced from something like 10, 11,000 in the 50s to just about 2,000, maybe slightly less. Management seemed to be very reluctant to give out reliable, accurate figures on this sort of stuff. So I took what I could from trawling through the Liverpool Echo and all the rest of it. Late in 1983, a new wave of redundancies was announced by the management of Cammell Laird, and the workers responded by refusing to accept any more redundancies. In 1984, they went on strike. At that time, the situation in the yard was quite critical. There were only two pieces of work that were left on the books. One was a gas rig, an accommodation rig for a North Sea installation, and the other was refitting a cruiser for the British Navy. The management said they were going to take the ships out, tow them to France, and refit them in a yard in France. The workers said no. They obtained immediately, great example of cross-union collaboration here, they got the cooperation of the tugboat union people, the Liverpool dockers, who all refused to have anything to do with moving the ships, and the workers went on strike. Very soon, it became apparent that it was only going to be an occupation that's going to stop the ships from being moved. So the workers crossed the Rubicon, or climbed over the fence, depending on how you see it, and they occupied the yard, settled on the rig, occupied the ship, and prevented them moving. There was a key date, and I don't have it with me offhand, but it was when there was a high tide, and this would be the time when the management would take the ship out and take them out to France to be refitted. So they made sure that the yard was clamped down by the day when this high tide arose. So the ship and the rig were stuck in the yard, the workers were occupying, they were getting enormous support locally, Liverpool Council, the local unemployed centre and the unemployed movement in Birkenhead and the Wirral, the trade unions of the area, and there was liaison between the striking miners and the Cammell Laird occupiers. In the pamphlet, I have a speech. I've included a speech from Lowell Duffy, where he spoke at Ollerton in Northamptonshire to an audience of speaking miners, and this was taken from the pages of Socialist Organiser. Sorry? Nottingham, yes. And this is taken from the pages of Socialist Organiser for the 26th of July. And I'll just read you the first paragraph. It just gives you a little bit of a taste. Lowell said to the striking miners, "We're in the 4th week of occupation at the yard now. It started over the management trying to take the 2 vessels that remain in the yard, a gas rig and a frigate. They're the only work we've got. That's about 6 months' work left on the gas rig and a few months on the frigate. If they take them out of the yard, it will be shut. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We've got the local tugboat men and the dockers to agree not to handle anything to do with the 2 vessels. At its peak, Cammell Laird employed about 30,000 people, it's going back longer than my time scale anyway, and had hundreds of apprentices every year. We're now down to 1,800. Another 400 redundancies went through this week." Quite a lot of the rest of the speech is included in the pamphlet, and you'll be able to read it. That's just to give you a taste. Excuse me. As is well known now, the 43 occupied the yard, and There are various rumours about this, and I'm not sure the whole story's ever come out, but there appears to have been some military involvement at some point during the occupation. Eddie Marnell tells the story, and Lord Duffy repeats it, that this rather well-dressed gentleman turned up at the gate one day and said, we're going to issue you with writs unless you disengage from the yard, unless you leave, and you will be put on trial, and there's a possibility you'll go to prison. The response of the occupiers was basically piss off. But then there seemed to be a ratcheting up of the situation. Someone who claimed to be from the SAS spoke to, I mean, it is a very odd story, this, and maybe it gets exaggerated over time, but spoke to one of the strikers and said, look, we're going to take you out. It's a bit like sort of high noon or something. We're going to take you out. Some of our men will probably get hurt in the process, and some of your men will probably get killed. You need to think about that. Now, whether this conversation actually took place or not, or whether it got exaggerated over a period of time, I don't know. But there was clearly some kind of threat. And when the official from the judiciary arrived at the yard a few days later with the documentation for their arrest, the workers had already had a meeting, and they decided that resistance, actual physical resistance, wouldn't be possible, worthwhile. The forces arraigned against them appeared to be too much. So they were arrested, and there were various sentences. I think the maximum was 4 months, some got 3 months. And they were carted off to Walton Jail in Liverpool. Now, I've never tasted the joys of Walton Jail, but apparently it is a shithole. It's a really disgusting place. In fact, it's so bad, it was actually the subject of a parliamentary inquiry some years later. And the administration of the jail was roundly criticised for the appalling conditions. So, although the sentences in themselves weren't that long, it was not a pleasant experience. And as Lowell said in one of his communications, which is also included in the pamphlet, he said, Walton Jail is absolutely horrible. The food is disgusting. And they were imprisoned alongside murderers, rapists, because Walton Jail was a high security prison and held some of the worst offenders from the local area. They were eventually released, and all the way through their imprisonment and after their release, the 37 ex-prisoners were still campaigning about the yard, and now a new campaign started up, which has been picked up by the GMB, and we hope our pamphlet will make a contribution to this, and the work of comrades will make a contribution. There's now a campaign headed by Eddie Marnell. It's such a shame he couldn't speak today, to get the convictions rescinded from the 37 who were jailed. These campaigns inevitably take time, and they're inevitably hard work. The campaign to obtain the removal of the prosecutions of the miners involved at Orgreave has been going on for some years now. I've been involved in it peripherally from time to time, though I live in Lancashire now. It's a bit difficult to get over to Yorkshire to get involved in any further stuff. These campaigns do take a long time, and unfortunately they are often punctuated with this: when the next Labour government comes in, we'll obtain the pardons of these men. So, we've got a next Labour government. So that's one of the, just to flag up to the comrades, that's one of the things we're going to have to watch if we get involved, if you get involved in this. So I've had a flagged up to finish, which I'll be very brief now. Make sure that your branch has got a stock of the pamphlets. They pair very well, I think, with the James Conley pamphlet. Experience has shown, since it's been on sale, that it sells very well at trade union conferences. So make sure next time you're at a union conference, you have a stock of the pamphlets. And remember that it's now over 37 years since this occupation took place. So it's a good reminder to people involved in the labour movement about what happened. I'll finish now. I just want to say thank you to Lowell Duffy. Without his cooperation, he now lives in Spain. It simply wouldn't have been possible to do this pamphlet. He sent me a load of material over, answered a lot of questions, and made his own contributions. So as we enter in this new phase of labour militancy, I think the pamphlet should play a part in that struggle, the part of memory, but also revival, renewal, and it's a document that I hope we can use as a tool in that ongoing struggle. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So just a sort of a few more things to add, like I said at the start. So whenever it was in a Unite conference, and we had a fringe meeting up in Liverpool on the campaign. Eddie spoke, and at the Liverpool meeting, we had people who came over from the Wirral, people who were at the Unite conference. And at that meeting, there was a lot of people who had either been involved in the occupation or whose family members were involved in it, or they were part of the trade union and labour movement at the time. And the occupation, you could tell by the way people spoke in that meeting, it really affected their understanding of the world, and they sort of held it with them for years afterwards. So it's not just like another sort of looking back at this thing happened and, and you're just telling a story about something. It really affects people's understanding of how it's possible to change society, like what it's like when people take over a workplace, when communities work together. And you could really tell that by the people who, like you said, people are a lot older now, but it really affected a whole generation of people who were around at the time. And again, like those people there were very much talking about like carrying on with the campaign and the importance of carrying on campaigning. Following on from that meeting, we also had a meeting with Wirral Trades Council, and Wirral Trades Council agreed to be part of helping continue promoting the campaign through the trade union and labour movement. Other thing at that meeting was that the current workers of Laird's were there, and their current representatives were at that meeting. So it's not just like a part of history, but it's a part of it's a living part of their history that they look to in the struggles that come next. So it's not just a sort of a point of history, it's actually a part of a sort of living movement. So in that meeting, Eddie talked about various sort of stories about what happened, and the people he spoke to when they took over the frigate. He said like they started off by initially letting all the military personnel on board, and but they realised that management were sort of were being honest about what they were doing on. So that was the point at which they decided that they were going to take it over completely and occupy. And they said that, but because they've been talking to the Navy personnel were actually supportive of them rather than on the side of management. So there was another alliance between the Navy personnel and the workers. They also talk about how they made the rig impregnable. So how they jammed off all the stairways, how they had to secure all the exits, how they organised within the occupation, and how they functioned within it. So various lessons from it, I think. One of the things was the importance of having meetings and discussions and votes. So like when they decided that they were going to walk up, they had to end the occupation because basically they had no access to water and electricity. They were going to be like sort of, you were being forced out. There was a vote, and the vote was 15 to 12 to leave the occupation at that point. So it wasn't, it wasn't everybody wasn't saying that they should, but there was votes within it. And I think the democracy within an occupation is a really important aspect of, what happens within, within the occupation. They also spoke about the people who came into the yard and the local community that helped get in food and supported them and made the continuation of the occupation possible. He also talked about the youth getting reporters in. So he had told a story of that 2 young women reporters approached them about coming onto the rig to do a report on what's going on in the occupation. And the story of trying to smuggle these 2 young women and a camera crew into the occupation, up a rig, which is like, these things are pretty high, like you've got to get people up like ladders and stuff, they're not just like easy to get into. So the story of getting these young women in and the impact the next day of that report happening from inside the occupation on a news report, then all of the sort of the management and the police are all sort of running around like crazy thinking, how does this happen? How are they getting this support? They're getting the story out, and the impact of that was really significant. So again, it's like when these things are happening, it's what you do next to try and get it known what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that particular story of getting those reporters in was a pretty spectacular, spectacular thing to do. And he says that to get them back out again was slightly more tricky. And the 2 young women got down really easily, but the camera crew, the sort of male camera crew, had to be carried out because getting down the steps was too difficult. So things like that really, stories like that really bring to life what it's like in the occupation. I think, again, the day that they came out, when they got arrested, the stories of what prison was like. I think, again, sometimes you can like over romanticize what it's like to get arrested in, in these situations, yet the reality of it was, it wasn't sort of glamorous getting arrested. You were in with people who, there was a real danger. You were locked up for 23 hours a day. There were sort of lots of threats while you were in prison, so it wasn't sort of a sort of glamorous, a glamorous experience. The other thing that he talked about was that he said that the Attorney General at the time, which was Michael Havers, came to visit them all individually in their cells while they were in prison, to basically say to them, if you sign this and sort of say apologise, then you'll all get released. And like all of them refused to sign it, sort of individually, none of them gave in to signing that. But again, it's like when, like John was telling the story of, was it the SAS? Wasn't it the SAS? I think when you see who's involved with this and the seriousness, the ruling class take these things really seriously because they actually understand that these are the moments that can be really pivotal to working class people being able to realise what happens when they take over control of production, and how it isn't just about controlling production, but the impact it has on the surrounding community too. So those levels of threats and the levels of involvement, I don't think should surprise us, because that's what the ruling class do, and that's how seriously they take these struggles. Again, like the meeting that Eddie did, talking about the ongoing fight for justice for people and why he's involved with that, but why it's important that we raise this. And I think it is really important that we raise this, keep raising these issues, because like I just said before, they're not just, we learn from the history of our movement, but they also have a really important role in what happens next, and understanding of how we can use these things in the struggles that we're involved with or will be involved with in the future. A couple of other things I just wanted to draw out of those lessons is, I I think the other thing that happened with the situation in Liverpool was that the occupation then sort of set the basis for what happened next in the Wallasey election campaign, where Lowell stood as a Labour candidate in Wallasey. And the movement that you create through that class struggle then sets the tone for what sort of election campaign you're going to run, how you build an election campaign. So it's not just about how you do the industrial stuff, it's also about how you organise politically and industrially, and you link those two things together. So those two things for me are really linked, between how a revolutionary socialist functions in a workplace and what the ideas are we take into the workplace, but then also what we do in the wider labour movement, and how we see those two things absolutely intrinsically linked. And it's through those sort of struggles that the wider labour begins to trust you and listen to your ideas, and listen to what your, the sort of the ideas how to take that movement forward. So again, on Merseyside, you've got a layer of people whose understanding of class politics came from those two things, which was the occupation and the industrial militancy, but also the political campaign around the Wallasey by-election, which it never ceases, it always never ceases to amaze me that you go into a meeting somewhere and there are people there who remember that, and they've learned their politics from the experience of those times. And also like sort of the lesson of like the role of revolutionary socialists in the class struggle, and we try and act as the memory of the class. So we like take in the lessons that we've learned from all of these points of history, and we make them real, and we bring them to life. So what are the lessons of those sort of occupations? Or that, again, some of the stuff I really like when you're looking back to sort of some of these occupations, is like the stuff around sort of getting in, like the point at which you make the decision, right, you've got to go and you've got to go now. The sealing of making the occupation safe, and how you, you seal all the doors and you make the occupation possible. The stuff like they always have, like these occupations always seem to have a list of rules that they circulate, which is like to do with like, pretty much always they're to do with like no alcohol and no damage. And again, there was some of the, if you look at some of the Canadian occupations in the 1980s, they've got all their rules about, how you function in an occupation. And they also like, there was one in particular when they talked about like afterwards they cleaned everywhere to make sure it was spotless, and they cut the grass, and they like tended to all the plants outside. So you make, when you're going into an occupation, you're also thinking, you're doing this as a political act, you're keeping it safe, you're showing how we can organise things, and it's all took extremely seriously. Again, with the Laird's occupation, you produce a bulletin to keep everyone informed. That bulletin keeps the workers informed, but also the wider labour movement informed, and you have political discussions within it. So you have like discussions of political history and theory within occupations. So there is. But I think it's not insignificant that it's one of the role of revolutionaries in these situations, who have a thought out view of history about what the working class need to do to change society. The impact of our people in those situations is really significant, and has a huge effect on how the occupations are run and the lessons that are learned from it. Okay, so I'll finish at that, and we'll open up to any questions or contributions.